It's Friday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, the Conservative commentator Tim Montgomery, the New Statesman's economics commentator Grace Blakeley, the Spectator's broadcast editor Cindy Yu, and the statistician David Spiegelhalter. Today, not much sign of a thaw as Theresa May meets Vladimir Putin for the first time since the Salisbury poisoning.
Russia needs to recognise its acts and stop acting in this way.
At home, the focus has already moved to the next Prime Minister and what the front-runner is saying about Brexit.
We are all basically staring down the barrel of electoral extinction unless we get this thing over the line.
And we'll look at another leadership contest where the front-runner might be in a bit of trouble.
Joe Biden was right when he said it was time to pass the torch to a new generation of Americans 32 years ago. He's still right today.
Right, so Vladimir Putin has given an exclusive interview to the Financial Times, which I think we will talk about several times throughout the programme. It turns out he's been watching the Tory leadership contest. So he was asked about his own succession, and then he said, of course, it's different from what you have in Great Britain. We in Russia are a democratic country. He then laughed and said, in your country, one leader has left, and the second leader, who is for all intents and purposes the top figure in the state, is not elected by a direct vote of the people, but by the ruling party. So, Tim, will the ruling party welcome that advice on democracy from Vlad?
Well, I don't know if you know, but I come from Salisbury. So Salisbury is a city that's been rather badly affected by President Putin over the last year or so. So I'm not keen on any advice from him. But no, I don't imagine the Conservative Party will take kindly of his advice. And seeing Theresa May's grim expression as she shook his hand in Tokyo, I don't think I've ever felt fonder towards Theresa May in that moment. She was
a bit late
certainly,
now.
yeah, I know, but she was certainly representing me in that.
Grace, I mean, he does have a point, though. It's not very democratic, is it?
He does. It's going to be another coronation, right? And Theresa May, lest we forget, was a coronation because Andrea Leadsom dropped out. And I mean, sure, it might be followed by a general election. But again, the big word there is might. There is going to be another leader that the British people haven't elected, and we still just don't know whether or not they're going to have a chance to say whether or not that is who they want as their Prime Minister. Instead, it's going to be left to a relatively small number of actually people with fairly extreme views in the Conservative Party. I think it's something like 70% of them favour a no deal, which is why Boris is doing so well.
I mean, we should remember Blair handed over to Brown in an unelected, non-contested
Yeah, I mean,
way.
I'm not all for, elections and proper democracy within parties. I actually don't think that we have nearly enough of that in any of our political parties.
Cindy, do you think the public actually care that they don't have a direct say in this?
Absolutely, I think they do. Yeah, definitely. And you see so much apathy as well. Today, on the Today programme this morning, they were talking to a focus group who said, well, we have opinions on Jeremy Hunt or Boris Johnson, but we don't get a say.
But how would you do it, though, where the public could have a say?
Well,
a giant national kind of primary?
No, you couldn't possibly do that for the leader of the Conservative Party.
So there's no other way?
There's no other way, but we'll see very shortly whether or not he does well, Boris Johnson, that is, in his first 100 days, or if Jeremy Hunt becomes Prime Minister, there'll be an election.
We'll talk about 100 days in a second. But, David, I mean, give us a statistical angle on this. How can we use statistics to democratically select the next Prime Minister?
Oh, that's quite difficult. When as
paper,
Cindy
work it out
said,
by the end of the show.
yeah, okay, I'm sure. As Cindy said, that is the way the Constitution runs for the Conservative Party. It's based on just 100,000 or so members who are rather old and got these extreme views. And we know what's interesting is that the pitch has been given to those. It's not as if there's a manifesto that they're accountable for the rest of the population. And so, I'm not quite sure whether the things that are being said now, in what sense they're going to be held to those in the future.
And the whole campaigning in poetry, governing in prose thing as well, yeah. So Ian Martin, turns out is a very, very clever chap, although I think we knew that, he's worked out that the Prime Minister will take office on the day they take office until the day of the Brexit deadline, which is the 31st of October, is precisely 100 days. That magic number in politics, even though it's slightly meaningless. And also, it seems that Boris Johnson has got a lot planned for his first 100 days. renegotiate the Brexit deal successfully with Brussels, get the Brexit deal through Parliament, form a government, first of all, and then maybe have an emergency budget. Is that too much to fit in 100 days?
I think what we're going to start seeing, actually, during this period is a lot more of the kind of politics of the emergency. I think we've started to see this already over Brexit, a kind of series of constitutional crises that have occurred as kind of Parliament has faced up against various institutions within the state. And I think we're going to see that a lot more and a move towards, actually, which is why Putin's comments are so interesting, a move towards more towards that kind of political system where a lot of power is vested in one individual. You know, this stuff about Boris potentially proroguing Parliament in order to push through no deal. Again, it's a very interesting transformation in the nature of the parliamentary system. And I think the thing that worries me most is that this is actually, rather than the kind of the stuff around Brexit, is the stuff around the emergency budget. Because Boris Johnson is, at his heart, a Thatcherite. If you look at his previous remarks, he's praised Thatcher prodigiously in the aftermath of the financial crisis. He talked when he was Mayor of London about the need to kind of get these the Gordon Geckos of London to kind of get back to business in order to make the city to work again. And, you know, his comments about he's the only one that was going to defend the bankers. The kind of move towards tax cuts, financial deregulation, all these sorts of things that are deeply unpopular with the general public, that he will have that 100 days to push through. That's the thing that worries me the most.
Tim, there's probably about 50 things there you want to react to.
Slightly more than...
think what your face looks like behind me.
Slightly more than 50, and I'm interested in the idea that tax cuts are unpopular. I'm not quite sure that's correct, but I think that's a caricature of Boris Johnson, and I think the thing that people get most wrong about Boris Johnson is that they think, you know, because of his stance on Brexit, he is a completely different figure from when he was Mayor of London. Actually, the guy that was Mayor of London, who backed gay marriage, who took lots of action on climate change, built lots of homes, he's still there. And I think what he wants to do for Britain is the same he tried to do for London. And I think we'll get in those first 100 days a huge emphasis on infrastructure spending, particularly, much more than tax cuts. He knows that the big challenge in this country is to heal the north-south divide. It's one of the biggest problems we face as a country. And I think the Labour politicians who always seem to be attacking Boris Johnson, are they always attacking him because they fear he's going to be a disaster for the Conservative Party or because they fear he's going to be a disaster for them? I think when Boris Johnson becomes leader and starts unveiling his agenda, particularly that one nation infrastructure agenda, we will slowly and steadily see politics tilt. And I think people are going to be very surprised that he's still a one nation Conservative that he was in London.
You mentioned this idea of an emergency budget, the politics of emergencies. The Times front page today talks about Boris Johnson, if he gets in, having an emergency budget to supercharge the economy in case there is a no-deal Brexit. And the centrepiece of that would be slashing stamp duty on homes. And so if you bought a house worth less than £500,000, you wouldn't pay any stamp duty at all. David, as a statistician, can you give us some rules of thumb about how to assess when politicians make pledges about big sums of money over certain periods of time? What should we just be judging them on?
Well, the Times had a very good article in which they took apart this perhaps £25 billion of an emergency budget and saying, well, in what way could that stimulate the economy? And pointing out that for tax cuts, actually, it looks like for every pound you might put in, you only get about 0.3 back, they would estimate, compared with putting in infrastructure, where they would say, you know, you do get a much bigger bang for your buck. When you stimulate the economy, you get more return. So that's, but in fact, because they also say that it's unpredictable, that this is taking a risk with an emergency budget. The other thing that's quite interesting in the Times is they point out that yesterday it was announced by Reuters, from reporting Office for National Statistics, that due to a revision in the way that GDP is calculated, from yesterday we're 26 billion a year better off than we thought we were, which is almost exactly the emergency budget. So
yeah.
We have in fact had that GDP rise yesterday, just like that.
I think that shows just how ridiculous the way that we calculate GDP and make these decisions is. But I think what's interesting about, you know, is he going to do infrastructure, tax cuts, etc.? Is he a Thatcherite? Is he a One Nation Tory? Look at the comparisons between this and what Donald Trump was saying when he was getting elected. It was infrastructure spending and tax cuts. And what have we seen? We've seen a massive programme of tax cuts pushed through, which have largely benefited Wall Street. And a lot of talk about infrastructure spending, but very little actual action. And I think this is exactly what we're going to see with Johnson. We'll have a huge raft of tax cuts that will largely benefit the rich and big corporations. And I would be surprised if Johnson would completely kind of upend the Osbornian wisdom of actually saying, no, we can't spend on infrastructure, even though it's going to boost the economy over the long run, because we just have to keep within this arbitrary figure of what is the deficit.
Tim, is Boris Johnson really channeling Donald Trump? He was even wearing an extra long tie today.
I know. Well,
those hustings in
Grace and I
Exeter.
probably don't agree on very much, but we both, before we came on air, looking at that tie and wondering what it meant. I think it might be just that he was slightly disorganised when he dressed, rather than trying to emulate Donald Trump.
Should we trust someone who can't dress themselves?
Well, I should probably leave the stage now. I don't know whether I'm the smartest person on earth. But look, there are similarities between them in some ways, but Britain is not America. And I think Britain has an attitude towards the public sector that Boris understands that's different from America. Grace is right. Those tax cuts that Donald Trump introduced were absolutely overly focused on helping the better off. I think with some pledges that Boris Johnson has already talked about, for example, raising the national insurance threshold right at the bottom. That, according to the Resolution Foundation, a left-leaning think tank, is a much better way of helping the poor than raising income tax thresholds. So I think he's very sensitive to the need for the Conservative Party to ride what we're seeing as one of the most interesting trends in politics at the moment. Brexit is changing the political map. We're seeing southern seats, prosperous seats move leftwards, and we're seeing sort of Midlands, northern seats move rightwards. By giving tax cuts for the low-paid, by emphasising the northern powerhouse, I think Boris Johnson will be in a very good position to capitalise on those trends.
Right, let's hear from the man himself, because he's been speaking at a Tory party hustings event in Exeter in the southwest, and he was asked about the P word, prorogation. Could he, as Prime Minister, suspend Parliament later in the year in order to push through, whatever word you want to use, a no-deal Brexit that's opposed by MPs? Let's hear what he had to say.
When it comes to weird devices such as prorogation, I'm certainly not attracted.
But you're still not going to rule it out.
Well, as I think I said last night, there are all sorts of things that remain on the table, but it's a very big and capacious table.
Cindy, we're sitting at a big table. Why is prorogation still coming up, and is it still on the table? And is actually that Boris saying he might be prepared to do it?
I think it's not him saying he might actually be. I mean, I think Boris is not actually a Thatcherite Tory. I think he's a One Nation Tory. I think he really cares about the Constitution, really cares about tradition. So prorogation for him would be an absolute last resort. But I don't think he can rule it out at this point, because he just doesn't know how the next 100 days is going to look. I mean,
So he might prorogue Parliament?
Well, possibly, maybe, who knows? But I think he wouldn't want to for people to hold him to it. But actually, just going back to the infrastructure spending point, I think we'll know what he plans on doing once we know who his Chancellor will be. You know, this week we've been hearing about Sajid Javid, who is much more of a let's put money in it sort of Chancellor, would-be Chancellor. But if he goes for Liz Truss, who's someone who's more fiscally responsible, more, free marketeer, then it'll be a different look. But I think the weight is tilting towards Sajid Javid at the moment.
Doing an emergency budget and hiring a Chancellor will be kind of like the easiest things that Boris will have to do in the first 100 days. He'll have to renegotiate the Brexit deal with Brussels. What do you think he wants to change in the Brexit deal? Like precisely?
I don't know if he knows precisely what he does want to change, but one thing that could change is a time limit or an exit clause. A time limit, I think, would be slightly pushing it a bit more, but an exit clause, a lot of almost all international treaties have exit clauses. So actually, I think the one similarity between Boris and Trump is that he is unpredictable. So the EU is running a bit scared at the moment, thinking maybe he will take us out with no deal.
How do you know that?
So Fraser Nelson's very good, my editor's very good column in this week's Telegraph talks about how Berlin is willing to talk to Boris Johnson about possibly an exit clause. Obviously, the EU, there's 26 other countries involved here, but France maybe could be put on side if Boris Johnson goes on a charm offensive. So, there's a lot of things that's possible, and Boris Johnson's appeal is that he is unpredictable. He is not going to be continuity May, and he's going to come in, knock things around a bit, and maybe that will make the EU run scared. Who knows?
So Jeremy Hunt, who, of course, is the other person in the Conservative leadership contest, he's arrived at the hustings in Exeter today as well. Very cash. I suppose it is a Friday, isn't it? What can we read? At least he's not got a very long tie. Yeah, I mean...
He's going for a David Cameron vibe, isn't he?
Do you think he is going for a bit of a David Cameron
last
vibe?
Last weekend as well at Birmingham, he had his sleeves rolled up, no tie, no script. Yeah, very much so.
Does that just show in these contests you've got to do whatever you can to distinguish yourself from the other person, even if it comes to neckwear and clothing? Or is that a completely ridiculous, facile point I've just made?
Well, we're talking about it, so in some way it's working. But he looks like a happy warrior. He's consistent. You're seeing, I think Boris Johnson's been a lot better in the last couple of hustings. He's more confident than he was at the weekend, which will assure a lot of supporters of his, like mine. But I think supporters of Jeremy Hunt will note, in contrast, that Jeremy Hunt just really consistent. He's put in really solid, not perhaps exceptional performances, but really solid performances on each occasion. And that, of course, is his pitch, really. It may not be exciting, but he's presenting himself to the Conservative membership in the country as the guy that you can rely on, that won't surprise you. And that probably won't be enough to overcome the huge lead that Boris Johnson has in this race, but it's a defining characteristic if Boris really messes up.
I think that looking at the general public, it is hard to... Most of the general public probably doesn't have any idea about who Jeremy Hunt is other than associating his name with a whole load of massive issues that he created in the NHS. And I think that that is going to be... It's underestimated and understated, I think, the extent to which that is potentially like a massive thing that would hold him back amongst the electorate. Because he was... we heard this the other day, that he was one of the worst health secretaries that we've ever had. Equally, Boris Johnson, one of the worst foreign secretaries
Who said he was one of the worst health secretaries?
I can't remember. It was someone was saying the other day, we saw this, that the two candidates...
I think it was one of the left-wing magazines you wrote.
And May defended both of them, saying that actually they weren't.
Well, one of the big things that Jeremy Hunt's been saying over the last couple of days is that Boris is not telling the truth about no-deal Brexit and what's going to happen. Boris Johnson, I should say, not Boris. What's going to happen if there's a no-deal Brexit, how realistic it is, what the chances of it are. Then Boris Johnson said there's a 1,000,000 to 1 chance. Mark his statistical homework.
I don't think there is 1,000,000. I checked on Betfair this morning, and it's operating at about 30%. If you can, so if it's 1,000,000 to 1, if he really thinks 1,000,000 to 1, I'd love to put on a bet.
Do you think that's really irresponsible of him, even to sort of speak in a statistical way?
It's like when most people use numbers. Numbers are generally used to persuade rather than to inform. And he just wanted to give over the impression that this was something that he wanted to consider possible, but actually it was very unlikely to occur. So he chooses the 1,000,000 to 1. So it's being used. It's not being used in a numerical phrase.
So it's okay.
I don't think that's
okay.
Well, 55.6% of statistics are made up on the spot.
Thank you very much.
My dad
I've never
used to
heard
say
that
that
one.
to me.
I've never heard that one before.
We will discuss that.
I'm sorry.
We'll discuss that after 58% of the programme has elapsed. Right, now we're going to go to America. Well, America's coming to us because we can now speak to Galen Druke from New York, who's our guest today. He works on the 538 website and blog and podcast, which is a big stato nerd fest about American politics, a bit like a podcast called Brexitcast, I might like to mention. Welcome to the programme, Galen. So, you were watching the big debate for the Democratic Party last night. Was it an enjoyable watch, would you say?
Hi, thanks for having me. Was it an enjoyable watch? You know, it was enjoyable for Kamala Harris supporters. They watched her do quite the job against Vice President Joe Biden. It probably was not enjoyable for Joe Biden supporters. But of course, you know, we'll see. We have yet to actually see the polls in response to this debate. So we'll see how things shake out.
OK, there's lots to discuss about it then, not least just the number of candidates. There were 10 people on stage last night, which means it quite often ended up a bit like this.
As the youngest guy on the stage, I feel like I probably ought to contribute to the generational conversation.
It's part of Joe's generation.
Please, we will let you all speak. Senator Harris.
We can't afford to wait for evolution on these issues.
Hey, guys, you know what? America does not want to witness a food fight. They want to know how we're going to put food on their table. Yes?
So, Galen, that was Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Kristen Gillibrand, Michael Bennet, John Hickenlooper, Eric Swalwell, Marianne Williamson and Andrew Yang. And that is only half of the field, because there was another debate the night before. Isn't that just totally crazy?
Yes, in fact, it's a historically large number of candidates who are running for president this year. And it says something about what people think about the vulnerability of President Trump. It also says something about the fact that there's no runaway frontrunner. Essentially, when there's a clear party favorite, somebody that there's already a consensus behind, you don't usually see a field this deep. The fact that there are 24 candidates at this point says a lot about how fluid the race is, really.
There are 24. I thought there was 20, so there's more of them appearing. OK. You mentioned...
So there were only 20 that made the debates, but 24 who have announced. So 4 people didn't even make the debates, but we'll see if they make the next round.
OK, so you mentioned that big moment between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden. This is about the role of race in the campaign and Joe Biden's past and some comments he made about it. Let's have a little listen to it and then get you to unpack it.
It's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of 2 United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
So an easy question for you, Galen. Who are those people? Why are they so important? And what on earth are they talking about?
What they're talking about is the fact that in a fundraising event, Vice President Joe Biden was talking about working across the aisle and said that in his history in the Senate, he had worked across the aisle, even with people who had segregationist backgrounds, to get things done. You know, she was also bringing up his history on busing and opposing any federal laws enforcing busing, you know, in order to desegregate schools. That was probably the key moment of the debate. If you look at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, that is the highlight from the debate that most people are talking about when they say that Kamala Harris did well and Joe Biden was under attack.
And of course, busing is this idea that you get kids from one neighborhood to go to school in another one and kids from a different neighborhood to go to that one, so that you get a much more kind of mixed school population. Let's have a look at another clip. This is from Eric Swalwell, who, if you didn't know, is a Californian congressman. I'm sure you're all very up to date with what Eric's been doing these days. He had another pop at, you guessed it, Joe Biden.
I was 6 years old when a presidential candidate came to the California Democratic Convention and said, it's time to pass the torch to a new generation of Americans. That candidate was then Senator Joe Biden. Joe Biden was right when he said it was time to pass the torch to a new generation of Americans 32 years ago. He's still right today. If we're going to solve the issues of automation, pass the torch. If we're going to solve the issues of climate chaos, pass the torch. If we're going to solve the issue of student loan debt, pass the torch. If we're going to end gun violence for families who are fearful of sending their kids to school, pass the torch.
So, Galen, I mean, I don't want to sound ageist at all in any way, but there are a lot of 70-year-olds hanging around in American politics these days. How does that play with the American public, with the American voter?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, he definitely makes a point. About 30% of the Democratic primary electorate this time around is going to be millennials. And, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that millennials are going to vote for a younger candidate. You saw in 2016, younger voters backed Bernie Sanders, who is one of those 70-something-year-olds. But there is, you know, we saw in the midterms younger people getting elected to Congress. Of course, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a great example of that, along with many others. And so there is an energy among younger voters right now, particularly in the Democratic Party, looking to kind of replace some of the elder statesmen within the party. And so, you know, it's not surprising that people will go after either Bernie Sanders or Joe Biden on this issue.
So we mentioned this was part 2 of the debate. Part 1 was a few days ago. And there, I think a lot of people are saying the star was Elizabeth Warren, 70-year-old senator. Let's have a listen to her.
When you've got a government, when you've got an economy that does great for those with money and isn't doing great for everyone else, that is corruption, pure and simple. We need to call it out. We need to attack it head on. And we need to make structural change in our government, in our economy, and in our country.
So, Galen, just help us out here. I mean, is there really a front runner? Is it kind of fait accompli who's going to win? Or is there going to be a surprise? Or is it going to go right to the wire? What do you think?
There is absolutely not. You know, OK, so there is a tentative frontrunner, and it is Joe Biden. We will see how things change after this debate. But what's important to keep in mind is that when you poll people about who they're considering, not just who they support right now, plenty of people do well. And so Democrats are open to supporting different types of candidates depending on how things go. We are still so far away, like 7 months away from actual voting in the primary. Things will change a lot. I will say one thing that happened last night that is key in, who will ultimately win the Democratic nomination is this conversation over race and the role that it plays in the Democratic Party and the candidates' positions on race. Right now, Joe Biden is getting 50% of the African-American vote in primary polls. And African-Americans play a very big role in deciding who the Democratic nominee is. Kamala Harris knows that. Of course, she's a mixed-race woman, and she wants to do well among that section of the electorate. And so it's important to watch after last night's debate if we start seeing African-American voters shift towards her away from Joe Biden, because that could be an early indicator that his frontrunner status is imperiled, because that is one of his strongest assets as a tentative front runner right now. So keep your eye on that in the coming days for sure.
Some good tips. I'm going to bring in the panel now. Be honest, who stayed up late and watched it?
I didn't.
No.
Okay, your politics junkiness has limits. Okay.
Watch clips.
Interesting, though, because we all thought that this race in the Democratic Party was going to be about public spending, who was a socialist and who wasn't. Actually, it sounds like it's turning out to be about race.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, I think, the issue about race in the US is that it is overlain with a whole set of other issues. It's not just a case of Kamala Harris's mixed race and therefore, she's going to carry the votes of African Americans. It's a question of policy commitments. You've seen Warren already commit to the abolition of private prisons, which is a really big issue. Issues around criminal justice, around gun violence, around inequality. All of these things are going to be a massive determinant of how African Americans do vote. But I think we also have to remember that the thing that splits people most in terms of who they're going to vote for in these primaries is age. And the socialist candidates, so Sanders and to a lesser extent Warren, carry a much greater sway over amongst those millennials, those younger voters, than say Biden, who is much more likely to carry older voters. And that is hardly surprising when you look at their commitments on policy. Things like abolishing student debt, Medicare for all. Again, it's bizarre, it's insane that we're having this debate in the richest country in the world still about whether or not they're going to get something that even closely resembles the NHS. And there are still candidates in this race that have not come out and endorsed Medicare for all, which is completely and utterly completely bizarre. So I think it's those policy issues that are ultimately going to sway primary voters in the end.
Tim, I mean, President Trump watching that on Air Force One on the way to the G20, will he have been quivering in his extra long tie at any of those contenders?
I don't think so. I think he will be looking at this contest with relish, because this is just the beginning of this process, and all those
7 months.
I know. We think our leadership races are long, but what he will be seeing is Democrat candidate after Democrat candidate knocking other Democrat candidates, and that gives all of them, they diminished all of them by this process. Now, a primary process at its best improves candidates, tests them, but if we get the kind of negativity that we saw the last night and the night before, repeated again and again, the Democrat Party will start to fracture. It's not a united party. It has very different views on spending. It has very different views on race. And a divided Democratic Party is what Trump wants.
Cindy, do you think, from watching those clips, they're actually doing damage to their own party brand rather than picking the best person?
I think certainly. I mean, the format of the debate is televised. It's got a live audience. You've got 10 people. You've got 1 minute to answer. It's baying for blood. It's gladiatorial. So I think that's not the best conducive format to go with. But actually, I don't think they're that different when they're talking about policies. Yes, they haven't all committed to Medicare for all, but a lot of them have. A lot of them have talked about decriminalising border crossings as well. These are quite left-wing things that 3 years ago, when Hillary Clinton was running, she would never have talked about this. So this Democrat Party, I think the biggest story here is how much to the left that everyone's conversation is going. And what does that mean when they go have a nominee and go to the country? Because there are so many Rust Belt voters who love Donald Trump and don't care about the climate and don't care about the Mexicans.
Galen, I hope you're still with us in New York. What do you make about the things about your race over there that have broken through to our panel over here?
It's interesting. I mean, of course, there is a divide between, the far left or whatever, the left, and the center and the progressive ideas of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. Last night, race was the focus because of the way that the debate played out between Biden and Kamala Harris. But yes, these policies absolutely are still going to get a lot of play in the race. I'll also say that, yes, like last night may have been a bit raucous, but if having, contentious debate within your party is an indicator of whether or not you'll win ultimately in the general election, there's no way Republicans would have won in 2016, right? I mean, so I don't think it's a great indicator. What I think the Democratic Party is hopefully is wanting out of these debates is a lot of viewers, people to get excited and invested in the primary, eventually vote in the primary and then stay tuned for whoever ultimately wins and be invested in that person. So right now they kind of just want viewers, and if they put on a good show and get people to listen to their policy ideas, that's a win for them.
Now, you do your feature on your podcast called Good Use of Polling, Bad Use of Polling. And we sent you a polling exercise from the UK where they asked voters who they'd vote for depending on who would be leader of the Conservative Party, whether it's Boris Johnson or Jeremy Hunt. And then they extrapolated from that using a website what that would mean in terms of seats won in the House of Commons and a potential government majority. Good use of polling, bad use of polling.
I'm going to give you the same answer I would give people who poll the general election right now during the Democratic primary and the Republican primary, of course, that it is a bad use of polling, right? You kind of need to see how the candidates actually campaign. Just one example is like, what is Hunt's name recognition right now, right? Like, if he were to actually become the leader and campaign, that would probably change, and views would change, of course, as well. Like, when May called the snap election, polls said one thing. After campaigning, polls definitely said another thing. And so this far out, it's not really worthwhile doing this kind of polling. I mean, and if you do want to get a sense of how accurate it is, go back and look at history and see whether or not this kind of polling done this far out from an actual election is predictive. In America, it's not. In Britain, it might be, but I doubt it.
Galen, thank you very much. We've got to let you go, but thanks for joining us. And comrades in the Telegraph, please pick up the phone when we call you in future still. David, you've got your book out, and this kind of touches on all of this stuff. The book is called The Art of Statistics, Learning from Data. Is that you acknowledging that statistics is an art, more than a science?
Well, we call it statistical science, but there's a huge amount of art in it and a lot of apprenticeship. And the book is supposed to take a different approach from how I learnt it and how I actually teach it, which is a sort of set of mathematical principles and probability theory. And I'm sure many of you will have suffered statistics courses in your education. And but there's a modern approach taken, which is much more to do with problem solving, with answering questions that people genuinely have, and like we're discussing around this table, where the question drives the collection of data, and then which may or not be able to answer the question. So the first thing is, is the data actually appropriate? So a lot of the art is in that judgment about whether the data can actually give you the answers that you want. And then, what do you do with it? And almost right at the end, there's the actual formulae and the tests you might do and you suffered under in your, I'm sure, at university. And but that's actually a tiny bit, and it isn't even in the book. I managed to do the whole book that thick without any formula at all, and yet deal with a lot of really quite subtle ideas about what we can genuinely learn from data. And I should actually mention, I'm really delighted you're using 538, because 538, Nate Silver, I give the opening quote in the book as saying that data doesn't speak for itself. We imbue it with meaning. It was a very powerful idea.
It's like we planned this programme.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. But 538 are great because they're so cautious about using data, and yet it is entirely data-driven. And they also, for example, never make predictions about who's going to win either in sport or election. They will just give probabilities. They're unwilling at the moment to give probabilities, even though if I noticed you could get 3-1 for Harris on Betfair this morning, but you could.
Could you give me a really good example from your book that I can use in the pub tonight that will make people go, wow?
Oh dear. Yeah, lots of it. Just read the book. It's full up with good examples. I mean, we got lots of funny ones. There's one I like we use about, what's the chance that the body they dug up under the car park in Leicester was really Richard III.
Oh yeah, ruin it for us. Go on.
No.
Go on.
No. The researchers reckoned it's 99.997% chance it really was Richard III. I think it's probably, I would put it slightly lower than that, but still is 99.9 something other. So I reckon they were justified in doing it. But they didn't just pluck that out of the air. There's a really detailed analysis by looking at the bones, the DNA, the curvature in the spine, the wounds after that were added post-mortem, trying to work out, well, how likely is that to happen to someone who died in 1485 anyway? It's an extraordinary bit of historical reconstruction, but based on mathematical principles. But it is answering a genuine question about should you be burying this guy with full honours in Leicester Cathedral.
OK. Now, I mean, our politics right now is dominated by some key bits of mathematics from the Brexit referendum in 2016.
Yeah.
Let's talk about them. So let's remind ourselves, as if you could forget. First of all, let's look at the infamous bus that Boris went around on. Boris Johnson went around on, and Michael Gove and others. We send the NHS, send the EU. Oh, that's the 50 million one. Do you remember there was different versions of the bus, wasn't there?
There's 50 million, 350 million a week.
Yeah, 350 million a week,
Yeah.
50 million a day. Let's
Yeah.
fund our NHS instead. Good use of statistics or bad use of statistics?
Well, for their campaign, it's a very good use of statistics because it looks like, you know, that was quite persuasive, and it only had to be a little bit of persuasive to switch the result of the referendum. I use this as a teaching example all the time, and I challenge any group of people to say, OK, say you're on the Remain side, make that number look small. Because, and again, it goes back to Nate Silver, it's how we tell the story. So the classic way, you know, £350 million a week, £50 million a day, 66 million people in the country, that's 80 pence a day, which is about a packet of cheese and onion crisps. We each send the EU a packet of cheese and onion crisps every day. Of course, that's assuming the number is right, which it isn't, but we won't go into that now. So, and I can make that number look small as being about 1% of GDP. If GDP is that, it's that much, and GDP has been growing at 2% per year anyway, and so, you know, really this is in the small change compared with the if you do it per pounds per person per day, it's 80 pence as opposed to the, you know, the £30 of government spending per person per day.
Well, because of course the Remain side then had their own magic number, which was unveiled.
I'm completely unbiased on this. I attack everybody.
OK, well, take it apart for us then, because remember George Osborne famously said, if we leave the EU, it will cost every household in Britain £4,300. And there is Liz Truss standing next to him all those years ago with a big billboard with the number. Big number, right number, wrong number?
No. That was a Treasury estimate saying that GDP is going to drop by 6% if we leave they provided a range of 4.8 to 7.8 to 8 point something or other, which of course they didn't tell you in that. But even that is based on numerous assumptions, and it's also about GDP change. And they divided it by the 27 million families, and then they get that number of 4,003. No, that is no way, you know, GDP per family is not same as family income or anything like that. So the number is being used inappropriately, and of course it's a projection anyway based on assumptions, and who knows what's going to happen. It's not like they were projecting that GDP would drop, it's just that they projected it would grow less than. Anyway, so whatever it is, it's a pretty dubious number, and also of course it didn't have the same emotional impact as the £350 million for the bus, which was so immensely clever. And in you know, my work as a statistician, you realise that numbers do have an emotional impact. They can be used in that emotive way.
I mean, Cindy, I very glibly said our politics is still haunted by those two numbers. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Good.
I mean, a conspiracy theory this week came out that Boris Johnson revealed all about his painting buses hobby because he wanted to push the results for the £350 million a week bus down further. When you Google Boris bus, I mean, I don't think that's actually true, but it just shows that bus pledge is going to be in our popular conscience for a long time. I think the use of statistics in politics is so interesting. These politicians are not really necessarily lying about the numbers that they're using. They might be wrong, but if you look at it in certain ways, okay, that's sort of right. So they're blagging, they're not actually lying. And that makes numbers in politics so hard to pin down at the moment. So when some politician talks about numbers these days, I'm instinctively like, well...
Do you think the public are the same? Do you think they've learnt from the bus and from the 4,300 that actually they should interrogate numbers, or can they just not be bothered?
Possibly, but interrogating numbers is so hard, as David's written about. But interrogating
if only there was a book that explained this before.
It's incredibly hard, and unless you're very, very clever, it's very hard for an average person to do, including myself. So I think, you know, you might be suspicious, but what are you going to do about it?
I think that's why there's such an important role for fact-checking organisations, whether it's like Reality Check of the BBC or Full Fact, whatever like that, and for those to be used as quickly as possible to counter claims, because again and again, numbers are being used to persuade us of something or arouse our emotions. And frankly, if they're used on the Today programme, the interviewer doesn't come back fast enough. And what they particularly never ask is how do you know? And that would flummox them.
OK, right, let's have some more numbers now just to confuse you, because here is a reminder that because of the BBC's coverage of Wimbledon, next week Joe will be on BBC One at the slightly earlier time of 11:45 for most of next week. Prime Minister's Questions will be on in its usual time of 11:15 on BBC Two. Some completely accurate numbers for you there. Let's talk about the fate of the entire world as seen by Vladimir Putin in his Financial Times interview with the editor of the FT. The liberal idea has become obsolete. Let's sum that up in a couple of seconds. Liberal idea has become obsolete? Yes, no?
Well, in the early 1980s, the Tory logo was a flaming torch. I don't know if you remember it. It looked a little bit more like an ice cream than a torch, but it stood then for liberty. And if I was to sort of have a logo designed for the Tory party now, I would have something like a home for security. And that, back to the Brexit campaign, the slogan wasn't set us free, it was take control. And that, I think, is what's missing in the liberal order at the moment, is that people do not feel that they have control over their lives, they feel insecure. And so Vladimir Putin has a political agenda when he describes all of this, and I don't think we should take him too seriously. But there is something really going wrong in the current liberal establishment. There is something where people do not feel the institutions of this liberal order, whatever you want to call it, are on their side. And they want those institutions reformed. Where we end up with all this, I don't know. But in the home sort of logo, identity, security, ownership, family, there's something which people are craving for in contrast to remote globalist institutions.
Grace, you're nodding a lot.
No, I find this super interesting because this is something, there is a crisis of the liberal world order, and there is absolutely no question about that. And I think that's manifested in a number of different ways. If we think of liberalism, liberalism is often caricatured as like we're committed to freedom and justice and institutions at arm's length from politics. Actually, what it really is a set of institutions that are kind of intended to guard a particular status quo. They designate the parameters of acceptable political change. And for a while, for this period kind of between, let's say, 1989 and 2007, that was the dominant kind of paradigm and framework. It was a set of institutions that was supposed to kind of contain political discourse, policy, etc., within this particular framework. And to naturalise that framework as well, to say that this is the way things are because it cannot be any other way. It's the end of history, there is no alternative, etc. And in 2007, all of that broke down. All of those certainties completely crumbled as those institutions were placed under the immense strain of attempting to contain a financial crisis, correspondingly high levels of inequality, economic breakdown, social breakdown. And you've seen the trust in all of our institutions across the board massively decline as people actually say, you know what, this framework that liberalism kind of gives to us and says, here you go, play around within this box, that's not working anymore. Increasingly, people on the left and the right are actually saying, no, we need to build a new box, we need to build a new set of institutions which contain a completely different set of assumptions about human nature, about progress, about society, etc.
Cindy, how would you design that new box? He's got a house, she's got a box.
I wouldn't design that new box. I'm absolutely a liberal, and I think liberalism is older than 1989. So I just think, if we go back to British liberalism, tradition goes back to the 18th century, and I think that's a wonderful thing. But I do think you're absolutely right that people were complacent about this end of history idea. I was born in China, and people in the outside the West always think, what Western liberalism, end of history? Everyone's going to go down that route. It's just not going to happen. But once we have it, we should protect it.
But modern liberalism isn't that sort of classical liberalism that you describe. I think a lot of people see modern liberalism as very illiberal, actually, that everything is tolerated that the sort of establishment likes, but the views and values of flyover America or Shire England or whatever are not tolerated.
Sure.
And it's that sense that there is a intolerance at the heart of modern liberalism, which is why liberalism is in trouble.
Tim, I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you to the panel. There are some nice, simple concepts about the future of the entire world and the political system for you to discuss over the barbecue at the weekend. See you. It's Friday, it's 12:50.